My perfect sister called me a disgrace at 11:47 p.m. on New Year's Eve, and 13 minutes later, her entire fake life exploded in front of our family while fireworks lit up the Austin sky. I'm Avery, and I'd spent years being the family disappointment. Vivian was everything I wasn't. Corporate lawyer, married to a tech executive, living in a mansion in the hills. Me? Freelance graphic designer, rented apartment, perpetually single. Every family gathering was a performance of my inadequacy, orchestrated by my sister with my parents as silent audience. She'd remind everyone I was still doing logo work for small businesses, still without a serious relationship, still playing at being an artist instead of having a real career. My parents never stopped her. They'd tell me later that Vivian only wanted what was best for me, that her criticism came from love. That New Year's Eve, watching her announce her husband Reed's VP promotion while everyone cheered, then watching her turn to me with that familiar cruel smile, I realized I'd never escape being her punching bag. She asked loud enough for everyone to hear if I was still making $5 logos, then told the entire party I was a disgrace to the family. Said I was approaching 30 with no career, no husband, nothing worthwhile to show for my life. That our parents deserved better than a daughter like me. I walked out to the garden at 11:40 p.m., tears streaming down my face, thinking I'd spend midnight alone while my family celebrated inside. Then my phone rang. Unknown number, a woman named Kelsey saying she was Reed's girlfriend, and that she needed me to let her into my parents' house at midnight, with proof that would destroy everything Vivian pretended to be. This is going to be a long story about that night, and everything that came after. If you want to hear how the family's golden child fell from grace while the disappointment finally found solid ground, you might want to stick around for what comes next. That way, you won't miss how perfectly a house of lies can burn. The party had started at 7. My parents' house was full of relatives and family friends, everyone dressed like they were attending a gala instead of a casual New Year's gathering. Vivian had arrived in a designer dress that probably cost more than my rent, Reed beside her looking every bit the successful executive in his tailored suit. They worked the room like politicians, accepting congratulations on his promotion, discussing their upcoming vacation to the Maldives, making sure everyone knew just how well they were doing. I'd arrived alone in a simple black dress I'd owned for 3 years. My aunt had immediately asked when I was going to find a nice man. My uncle wanted to know if my design work was finally picking up. Every conversation was a subtle reminder that I wasn't measuring up to the family standard, the standard Vivian set and exceeded effortlessly. Dinner was worse. Vivian dominated the conversation, talking about Reed's new role as Vice President of Innovation, the corner office he'd be moving into, the substantial raise that came with it. My father beamed with pride, mentioning how lucky they were to have such a successful son-in-law. My mother kept glancing at me with this look that mixed pity and disappointment, like she was wondering where she went wrong with me. After dinner, when Reed's promotion was officially toasted, Vivian had turned her attention fully to me. She asked about my work in that tone that made it clear she already knew the answer would be inadequate. When I mentioned I'd landed a contract with a local tech startup, she'd laughed and said that was cute, that I was doing what she called logo work, while real designers at major firms were shaping brand identities for Fortune 500 companies. She said it loud enough that conversations around us stopped, everyone suddenly paying attention to my public dissection. Then came her final assessment. She stood there with a champagne flute in her hand, surrounded by our family, and announced that I was a disgrace. That I was approaching 30 with nothing to show for myself. No serious career, no husband, no real accomplishments. That our parents deserved better than watching their daughter waste her potential playing at being an artist. That maybe if I'd applied myself like she had, I wouldn't be such an embarrassment. No one defended me. My parents looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Reed just smiled slightly, like he agreed with every word. The other guests shifted awkwardly, but no one told Vivian she'd gone too far. Because she never went too far in their eyes. She was the success story. She could say whatever she wanted. I excused myself and walked outside. The garden was cold and quiet, decorated with string lights that blurred through my tears. It was 11:40 p.m. In 20 minutes, everyone would be counting down to midnight, celebrating new beginnings, while I stood alone processing the fact that my own sister despised me enough to humiliate me in front of our entire family. Then my phone rang. The number wasn't saved in my contacts. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The woman on the other end said her name was Kelsey, and that she was Reed's girlfriend. I told her that was impossible, that Reed was married to my sister. She said she knew that. Said she'd been with Reed for 4 years, that they had a daughter together, a little girl named Maya, who just turned 2. That Reed split his time between 2 complete lives, the public one with Vivian and the private one with her. I couldn't process what she was saying. It sounded insane. But then she told me why she was calling, said she was parked outside my parents' house right now, that she had proof of everything, photos, birth certificates, messages, that she needed me to let her in through the side gate at midnight when everyone would be distracted with the countdown. That Vivian had known about her for 2 years and had made an arrangement with Reed to keep up appearances rather than divorce him. That my perfect sister had consciously chosen to stay in a fake marriage because status mattered more than dignity. Kelsey said Vivian deserved to have the truth exposed in front of everyone, that she'd destroyed her life knowingly, deliberately, and should face the consequences. She asked me to please help her, said I deserved to see who my sister really was. I stood in that freezing garden, checking my phone. 11:47 p.m. 13 minutes until midnight. 13 minutes to decide if I was going to blow up my sister's perfect life the same way she'd spent years trying to destroy my sense of self-worth. I walked to the side gate and unlocked it, my hands shaking in the cold, or maybe from what was about to happen. Kelsey was standing at the gate at 11:58 p.m. She looked younger than I expected, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that held equal parts fear and determination. She was clutching a leather folder against her chest, like it contained nuclear codes. She thanked me quietly, her voice shaking, and we moved through the dark garden toward the back of the house. Inside, I could hear my family starting the countdown preparation. Someone had turned on the television to watch the Times Square ball drop. The volume was up, people gathering in the living room with their champagne glasses ready. Vivian's laugh cut through the noise, that performative, perfect laugh she used when she wanted everyone to notice her. Kelsey and I entered through the kitchen at 11:59. She was right behind me as we walked into the living room. Vivian saw us first. I watched the color drain from her face, watched her mouth open slightly, watched her hand tighten around her champagne flute until I thought the glass might shatter. Reed was talking to my uncle and didn't notice us yet. The countdown started. 10, 9, 8. Kelsey stepped forward and shouted for everyone to stop. Her voice cut through the celebration like a knife through silk. Everyone turned, confused. 7, 6, 5. The TV kept counting down in the background, but every person in that room was staring at us now. Reed had spotted Kelsey and his face went completely white, all the executive confidence evaporating in an instant. 4, 3, 2, 1. The TV announcer screamed Happy New Year while fireworks exploded on screen. Outside, I could hear the neighborhood erupting in celebration. Inside my parents' living room, there was absolute silence except for the television. Kelsey opened her folder and threw photographs onto the coffee table. Pictures of Reed with her. Reed kissing her. Reed holding a little girl with dark curls and his exact same eyes. She announced to my entire family that Reed had a daughter with her, that the child's name was Maya, that they'd been together for 4 years, that Reed maintained 2 complete lives, splitting his time between his legal wife and his actual family. My mother made a small sound of shock. My father stepped closer to the table, picking up one of the photographs with shaking hands. Other guests were leaning in, trying to see what was happening, confusion rippling through the room. Then Kelsey pulled out a birth certificate. Maya Hayes. Father listed as Reed Hayes. She handed it to my father, who read it slowly, his face getting redder with each second. Kelsey was pulling out her phone now, showing text message screenshots. Reed telling her that Vivian knew about their relationship. Reed explaining they'd made an arrangement, that Vivian would stay legally married for appearances, and he would continue supporting Kelsey and Maya discreetly. The room erupted in whispers. My aunt demanded to know if this was true. My uncle was asking Reed what the hell was going on, but Kelsey wasn't finished. She turned to face Vivian directly and said that my sister had known for 2 years, that Vivian had discovered the affair and the child, and instead of divorcing Reed, had negotiated an arrangement. Kelsey showed more screenshots. These ones from Reed's messages to her, explaining Vivian's terms. Vivian had told Reed she didn't care about the affair as long as Kelsey and Maya stayed away from her social life. That she'd rather have a fake marriage with money than face the embarrassment of divorce. My mother whispered my sister's name like a question. Asked if it was true, if she'd really known. Vivian tried to maintain her composure, saying it was a private matter between her and her husband, that it wasn't anyone else's business. But Kelsey had saved the worst for last. She pulled up more messages, screenshots of a conversation between Vivian and Reed, where my sister referred to Maya as the mistake, called Kelsey a controlled problem, wrote explicitly that she preferred a fake marriage with access to Reed's income over a divorce that would damage her reputation. That keeping up appearances mattered more than self-respect. That as long as her credit cards kept working, she didn't care who Reed was sleeping with. My father read the messages on Kelsey's phone, and I'd never seen him that angry. His hands were shaking as he asked Vivian how she could be so cold, how she could call a child a mistake, how she could make an arrangement like this and then have the nerve to judge me, to call me a disgrace when she was the one living a complete lie. Vivian tried to defend herself, said she'd been protecting the family from scandal, that she'd been trying to keep everything together, that I wouldn't understand because I didn't have anything to protect. My mother was crying now, asking Vivian how she could treat me the way she had when her own life was built on lies, how she could humiliate her own sister while hiding something like this. The worst part wasn't the betrayal or the fake marriage. It was reading those messages and realizing Vivian had looked down on me for years while knowing she was a fraud. She'd called me a failure while consciously choosing to stay with a man who had a whole other family. She'd made me feel worthless for being authentic while she lived a performance. Reed tried to leave. Kelsey blocked his path and told him he was going to acknowledge his daughter publicly, that she was taking him to court for formal paternity recognition, back child support, everything. She turned to Vivian and said my sister needed to stop pretending she was better than everyone else. The party was over. Guests started leaving quickly, whispering to each other, phones probably already out, texting other people about what they'd just witnessed. My parents sat in stunned silence, looking at Vivian like they'd never seen her before. And Vivian just stood there, her perfect New Year's Eve dress, and her perfect hair and her perfect makeup, surrounded by the wreckage of the perfect life she'd curated. The mask had fallen, and underneath was something none of us had wanted to see. The next morning, my phone had 17 missed calls. 12 from Vivian, 3 from my mother, 2 from Reed. I ignored all of them and made coffee, sitting in my small apartment and processing what had happened just hours before. Vivian started damage control immediately. She called our relatives one by one, trying to spin the story. I heard through my cousin that she was saying Kelsey was an obsessed stalker, that Reed had made a mistake years ago, that she'd been trying to handle the situation privately with grace and discretion. She positioned herself as the noble wife standing by her flawed husband, as if keeping a secret arrangement for money was somehow dignified. But the messages Kelsey had shown were already circulating. Someone had taken photos of the screenshots with their phone. By New Year's Day afternoon, half our extended family had seen Vivian's actual words, calling a 2-year-old a mistake, treating Reed's infidelity like a business transaction, admitting she valued her credit cards more than her integrity. Reed was trying a different approach. He called me 3 days after the party, his voice careful and measured, asking if we could talk. He wanted to explain his side of things, he said, wanted me to understand the complexity of the situation. I told him I understood perfectly. He'd lived a double life for 4 years, fathered a child, and conspired with my sister to maintain a fraud. He got quiet, then asked if I could convince Kelsey to be reasonable about the legal situation. That's when I understood why he'd really called. He thought I had influence with her, thought I might help him minimize the damage. I told him he'd underestimated a lot of women in his life, and I wasn't going to be another one. Then I hung up. My parents came to my apartment that weekend. They'd never visited before. Had always insisted I come to their house for family dinners and holidays, like my space wasn't worth the drive. Now they sat in my small living room that Vivian had mocked, drinking coffee from my mismatched mugs, and apologized. My father said he'd been blind, that he'd let Vivian's achievements overshadow her character, that he'd allowed her to tear me down because he'd believed success meant she must be right about everything. My mother cried and said she'd failed me, that she should have stopped Vivian years ago, that she'd been so proud of having a daughter who seemed to have it all together that she'd ignored how cruel that daughter had become. She asked if I could forgive them for all the times they'd stayed silent while Vivian picked me apart. I told them I needed time, but that I appreciated them finally seeing the truth. They left looking older than they had on New Year's Eve, like a weight they'd been carrying had shifted but hadn't gotten lighter. Meanwhile, Vivian was frantically trying to reach me. Her messages shifted from defensive to desperate. She needed me to understand her position, she said. Needed me to see that she'd been trapped in an impossible situation. That she'd made the best choice she could under difficult circumstances. That family should support each other. I didn't respond to any of it, but I watched. I watched Vivian post carefully curated photos on social media, showing her and Reed together, trying to project normalcy. I watched her reach out to friends in her social circle, attempting to control the narrative before it spread. I watched her schedule lunch with our mother, probably trying to repair her image as the dutiful daughter. What fascinated me most was how calculated it all was. Even in crisis, Vivian was performing, managing perception, trying to manipulate her way back to respectability. She'd spent so many years making me feel inadequate for living authentically, and now I could see why. Authentic meant vulnerable. Authentic meant admitting flaws. Vivian had built her entire identity on an image of perfection, and she literally didn't know how to exist without that mask. The irony was that in trying to destroy me, she'd given me the greatest gift. All those years of criticism had forced me to build genuine confidence in who I actually was, because I had nothing else. No fake marriage to hide behind, no appearance to maintain, no performance to perfect. Just me, trying to do work I cared about and live honestly. Vivian had a mansion and a corner office and a luxury car, and she was more trapped than I'd ever been in my rented apartment, because I could rebuild from authenticity. What could she rebuild from? A foundation of lies? I realized something sitting there in my apartment, watching Vivian's desperate attempts to salvage her image play out through family group chats and social media. I wasn't the family disappointment anymore. I never had been. I'd just been the only one brave enough to be real. And now everyone could see the difference between real and performed. The family's opinion of me had shifted overnight. Suddenly, my freelance work wasn't a failure. It was independence. My single status wasn't a problem. It was standards. My small apartment wasn't inadequacy. It was living within my means, honestly. Everything Vivian had used to make me feel small now looked like integrity in comparison to her choices. And that terrified her more than anything Kelsey had exposed. Kelsey filed her lawsuit 2 weeks after New Year's. Paternity recognition, retroactive child support, formal custody arrangement. She hired a lawyer who specialized in family law and made sure every document was airtight. The case was public record. Reed Hayes, VP of Innovation at TechCore Solutions, being sued by the mother of his 2-year-old daughter. That's when things really started falling apart for them. Reed's company had a morality clause in their executive contracts, maintaining certain standards of conduct, representing the company appropriately, no behavior that could damage the brand's reputation. A secret second family and a lawsuit weren't exactly the image TechCore wanted for their leadership team. I heard through my father, who'd heard through a colleague, that Reed's promotion was being reconsidered. The VP title he'd just received was suddenly in jeopardy. The news reached Vivian's law firm next. Corporate law thrives on reputation and trust. Clients need to believe their attorneys have judgment and integrity. A senior associate who'd knowingly stayed in a fraudulent marriage while calling her husband's child a mistake didn't exactly inspire confidence. Partners started excluding her from client meetings. Her name was quietly removed from high-profile cases. But the worst damage came from their social circle. The country club, the charity galas, the networking events that Vivian had built her identity around. She became a pariah overnight. Other wives didn't want to be associated with someone who'd made that kind of arrangement. They questioned her judgment, whispered about what kind of person trades dignity for a credit card. Vivian's carefully curated image as the successful, sophisticated, put-together woman shattered, and with it went all the social capital she'd accumulated. I watched it happen through family updates and mutual acquaintances. Vivian stopped posting on social media. She stopped attending events. She'd built her entire life on how things looked, and now everything looked like failure. Meanwhile, my phone rang with opportunities I never expected. A friend from college who'd seen the New Year's drama through the grapevine reached out. She'd started a tech company and needed a creative director for their branding division. The salary was 6 figures, more than I'd made in 3 years of freelancing combined. She said she'd always admired my work, but had thought I was committed to staying independent. Now she was offering me a full-time position with benefits, equity, everything. I took the meeting. The startup was growing fast, the culture was collaborative, and they gave me complete creative control over the brand identity. I signed the contract 3 weeks after New Year's. Suddenly I had the stable career Vivian had always said I'd never achieve, doing exactly the work she'd mocked as inadequate. My mother called me the day I posted about my new job on LinkedIn. She said she'd shown my father, and they were both proud of me. That they should have been proud all along. That my path had been unconventional, but genuine, and they were sorry it took a crisis for them to see that. She said Vivian had called her that morning, crying, saying she'd lost a major client, that everything she'd worked for was crumbling. My mother sounded devastated, caught between 2 daughters whose positions had completely reversed. I felt sympathy for my mother, but not for Vivian. Because here's what I'd finally understood. Vivian hadn't criticized me all those years because she genuinely thought I was failing. She'd attacked me because she was jealous. Jealous that I had the courage to live authentically while she was trapped in a performance. Jealous that I could be satisfied with less because I valued different things. Jealous that I didn't need a mansion and a title and a perfect marriage to feel worthwhile. Every insult she'd thrown at me, that I had no real career, no husband, no accomplishments, had been projection. She'd had all those things and known they were hollow. Fake job security propped up by her firm's tolerance, a fake marriage maintained by willful blindness, accomplishments that were impressive on paper, but meaningless in reality. She'd called me a disgrace because she'd known she was exactly that, and she couldn't stand looking at someone who'd chosen substance over surface. I started seeing Cameron around this time. He was a developer at my new company, quiet and genuinely kind. He asked me to coffee after a team meeting, and we talked for 3 hours about design philosophy and terrible sci-fi movies, and absolutely nothing about my family drama. He didn't know about Vivian or Reed or any of it, and I didn't tell him right away. It was refreshing to be seen just as myself, not as part of some scandal. When I finally did tell him weeks later, he listened carefully, and then said the kindest thing anyone had said to me. He told me he was sorry my sister had treated me that way, but he wasn't surprised I'd survived it with so much grace. That the kind of person who could handle that much judgment and still maintain their integrity was the kind of person worth knowing. Vivian tried to reach out to me during this time. Left voicemails saying we needed to talk, that she needed her sister right now. I listened to them once and deleted them. She'd never been my sister when I needed someone. She'd been my critic, my judge, my constant reminder that I wasn't enough. Now that her world was collapsing, she wanted family support. But family works both ways, and she'd burned that bridge years before the New Year's fire. Reed's situation got worse. TechCore rescinded his promotion officially in March. They kept him employed but moved him to a different division with less prestige and a smaller team. His corner office went to someone else. The Maldives vacation was canceled. Kelsey's lawyer was pursuing everything aggressively, and the legal fees were mounting. The marriage that Vivian had sacrificed her dignity to maintain was turning into an anchor, dragging them both down. Reed started staying late at work to avoid going home. Vivian started drinking more wine at family dinners, her hands shaking when she thought no one was watching. The perfect couple was dissolving, and there was no arrangement they could make to fix it this time. My father mentioned during one of our newly regular dinners that Vivian had asked them for money, that the legal fees and the damage to Reed's income were stretching them financially, that she'd seemed shocked when he'd told her they'd help with necessities, but wouldn't fund a lifestyle built on fraud. He said he'd never seen her look so lost. I told him it was probably the first time she'd faced genuine consequences for her choices, that she'd spent her whole life being rewarded for looking perfect, and now she was learning that appearance without substance eventually crumbles. He nodded slowly and said he'd taught her that he'd praised her achievements and ignored her character, and now she was paying for the values he'd instilled, that he was trying to do better with both his daughters now, but the damage had been done. Everything Vivian had built was falling apart. Not because of what Reed had done, but because of what she'd chosen to do in response. She could have left him when she discovered the affair, could have maintained her dignity and her integrity. Instead, she'd made a calculated decision to stay for the wrong reasons, and now everyone knew what she'd traded her self-respect for. The saddest part was watching her try to hold on to the pieces. She still went to work every day at the firm that was slowly pushing her out, still posted occasional photos trying to make her life look normal, still called our mother crying about how unfair everything was, as if she was the victim of circumstances rather than her own choices. But people who build castles on sand always lose everything when the tide comes in, and Vivian's tide was rising fast. Reed filed for divorce in late May. I heard about it from my mother, who'd heard from Vivian during a tearful phone call at 2 a.m. After everything, after Vivian had arranged her entire life around maintaining the appearance of marriage, after she'd endured public humiliation and social exile to keep her status as Mrs. Hayes, Reed had decided he'd rather be with Kelsey anyway. The irony was brutal. Vivian had sacrificed her dignity for a marriage she thought she was protecting, and Reed was walking away from it regardless. All that calculation, all that careful management of appearances, all that compromise of values, and she was ending up divorced anyway. Except now she was divorced, and everyone knew what she'd been willing to tolerate. Kelsey and Reed made it official quickly after that. He moved in with her and Maya, started posting photos of his daughter on social media, played the role of devoted father he'd hidden for years. The tech community seemed willing to forgive him faster than they'd forgiven Vivian. There was something about a man trying to make things right with his child that people wanted to believe in. Meanwhile, Vivian was still being frozen out of networking events and client meetings. The double standard was obvious but not surprising. Reed was rebuilding his image through his relationship with Maya. Vivian couldn't rebuild because she'd never built on anything real to begin with. My career was flourishing. The startup I'd joined had landed 2 major clients, and my branding work was being featured in design publications. I'd gone from making $5 logos to directing the creative vision for companies with $1 million budgets. The same work Vivian had mocked was now being recognized by the industry she'd claimed I'd never break into. Cameron and I were getting serious. He'd met my parents, integrated himself into my life with an ease that felt natural and unforced. He treated me like an equal partner, asked my opinion, celebrated my successes without competition or resentment. It was so different from watching Vivian and Reed's transactional relationship that sometimes I couldn't believe it was this simple to be with someone healthy. I took him to meet my parents for Sunday dinner in June. Vivian was there, thinner than I'd ever seen her, dark circles under eyes that didn't meet anyone's gaze. She was polite to Cameron, asked appropriate questions about his work, smiled at appropriate times. But there was something hollow about it, like she was going through motions of civility without understanding why. After dinner, she asked if we could talk privately. We went out to the same garden where I'd stood crying on New Year's Eve, where Kelsey had called me, where everything had started. Vivian looked at me with something I'd never seen before. Genuine vulnerability mixed with confusion, like she'd lost the map to her own life. She told me she'd made mistakes, that she'd been wrong about so many things, that she'd valued the wrong priorities and hurt people who didn't deserve it. She said she was sorry for how she'd treated me, that she could see now I'd been living authentically while she'd been performing a role, and she didn't know how to fix any of it. I looked at my sister standing there in the same designer clothes that now looked too big on her frame, and I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction in her fall, but sadness that she'd built herself so high on such a weak foundation that the crash had broken something essential. I told her I appreciated the apology, but that sorry didn't erase years of deliberate cruelty. That she hadn't just made mistakes, she'd made choices. Every time she'd humiliated me at a family dinner, that was a choice. Every time she'd called my work inadequate, that was a choice. Arranging to stay married for appearances while knowing about Maya was a choice. And choices have consequences. She asked what she should do now, how to rebuild, where to start. And I realized she genuinely didn't know. She'd spent so long being the perfect daughter, the perfect professional, the perfect wife, that she had no idea who she actually was underneath all those performances. She'd never developed a real sense of self, just a collection of achievements and images she thought defined worth. I told her she needed to figure out what she actually valued beyond how things looked. That she needed to decide what kind of person she wanted to be, rather than what kind of person she wanted people to think she was. That the difference between us wasn't talent or success. It was that I'd always known who I was, even when everyone told me it wasn't enough. She'd never let herself know who she was because she'd been too busy trying to be impressive. She looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. Then she nodded slowly and went back inside. I stayed in the garden for a while, watching the same string lights that had blurred through my tears 6 months ago, thinking about how completely our positions had reversed. Inside, I could hear Cameron talking with my parents, easy conversation and genuine laughter. I had a career I was proud of, a partner who respected me, parents who finally saw my worth. Everything Vivian had said I'd never have, I'd found. And I'd found it by being exactly what she'd called a disgrace, authentic. The divorce was finalized in August. Vivian had to move out of the mansion into a modest condo. Reed and Kelsey were planning a wedding. My former brother-in-law was getting his fairy tale ending with the woman he'd kept secret, and my sister was left with nothing but the wreckage of the life she'd tried so hard to preserve. I saw her at a family barbecue in September. She showed up alone, drove herself in a car that was nice but not luxury, wore clothes that were professional but not designer. Everything about her had downsized, and not just materially. She seemed smaller somehow, less certain, moving through the gathering like she wasn't quite sure she belonged anymore. She tried to chat with relatives who gave her polite but distant responses. She attempted jokes that fell flat. She sat alone for long stretches, watching family dynamics she was no longer central to, and I wondered if this was how I'd felt for years, present but peripheral, included but not celebrated. The difference was I'd built genuine connections despite being underestimated. Vivian had only ever had superficial relationships based on her success. And now that the success was tarnished, the relationships had evaporated. She was learning the hard way that respect built on achievements is conditional. Respect built on character lasts. Before she left, she came up to me and Cameron. She said she was glad I'd found someone good, that I deserved happiness. She said it without the edge I'd always heard in her voice, without the implicit comparison that used to make every compliment feel like criticism. She said it like she actually meant it. I thanked her and told her I hoped she found what she was looking for. She smiled slightly, sadly, and said she didn't even know what that was anymore. Then she left, and I watched her drive away in her regular car to her regular condo, having lost everything she'd thought defined her worth. And I realized that was the real tragedy. Not that Vivian had fallen from grace, but that she'd built her entire sense of self on grace she never actually had. She'd confused appearance with substance for so long that when the appearance shattered, there was nothing underneath to stand on. Some people need to lose everything to figure out who they are. I'd learned that in my apartment with my freelance work and my authentic life. Vivian was just starting that lesson now, years later, and much further to fall. Vivian reached out to me again a month ago. October rain was hitting my apartment windows when I saw her name on my phone screen. We hadn't spoken directly since the barbecue, just existed in the same family orbit occasionally, politely distant. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. She asked if we could meet for coffee. Said there were things she needed to say, things she'd been working through with a therapist. I was surprised she was seeing someone. Therapy required admitting you needed help, which wasn't exactly Vivian's strong suit, but I agreed to meet. We sat in a quiet cafe downtown, rain making patterns on the windows. Two sisters who barely knew each other despite sharing blood and history. She looked healthier than at the barbecue, less hollow, like she'd been eating properly again. But there was something different about her beyond the physical, a quietness that seemed genuine rather than calculated. She told me she'd been unpacking why she'd treated me the way she had for so many years, that her therapist had helped her see patterns she'd been blind to. She said she'd been taught early that worth came from achievement, from looking successful, from meeting external standards, that our parents had praised her grades and her college acceptance and her job offers, and she'd learned that love was conditional on performance. She said watching me choose a different path had terrified her, because if I could be happy without checking all those boxes, without meeting those standards, it meant she'd sacrificed parts of herself for validation she might not have needed, that she'd traded authenticity for approval, and seeing me refuse to make that trade felt like an indictment of her choices. So she'd attacked me, called my work inadequate, because if it wasn't inadequate, what had she given up her creative dreams for? Called me a failure, because if I wasn't failing, what did her success actually mean? Every insult had been self-defense, protecting herself from the possibility that there might be different ways to live that didn't require her level of compromise. When she'd discovered Reed's affair and the child, she'd faced a choice. She could leave with her integrity intact, or she could stay and maintain the appearance of the perfect life. And she'd chosen appearance because appearance was all she knew how to value. She'd thought that arrangement made her smart, sophisticated, mature. She'd thought tolerating the intolerable was strength rather than cowardice. She said watching everything collapse had forced her to confront who she actually was without the performance. And she'd discovered she didn't know. She was trying to figure that out now, in her regular condo with her diminished social circle and her tarnished reputation, trying to build something real instead of impressive. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, didn't think she deserved it. But she wanted me to know that she saw me clearly now, maybe for the first time. Saw that I'd been braver than her all along. That living authentically despite criticism took more courage than performing perfection for applause. That I'd been right and she'd been wrong, about almost everything that mattered. I sat with her words for a long time, watched the rain, and thought about the years of feeling inadequate, the family dinners where I'd been the disappointment, The moments when I doubted myself because Vivian's voice was so loud and so certain. I thought about the girl who'd cried in the garden on New Year's Eve, and the woman I'd become since then. I told her I accepted her apology, that I understood she'd been trapped in patterns that weren't entirely her fault. But I also told her that understanding didn't erase impact, that she'd hurt me deeply and repeatedly, and that changing now didn't undo years of damage, that I was glad she was trying to be better, but we'd never have the relationship we might have had if she'd chosen differently earlier. She nodded, eyes wet, and said she understood. Said she'd lost more than a marriage in the past year. She'd lost time with a sister she'd never really known, chances to support instead of criticize, moments that could have been connection instead of competition. She said she was trying to be okay with living with those losses, with accepting consequences of her choices. We finished our coffee and parted with an awkward hug. It wasn't reconciliation exactly, but it was honest. Real in a way nothing between us had ever been. Walking home through the rain, I thought about masks and performances and the exhaustion of maintaining facades. Thought about how Vivian had worn hers for so long it had fused to her face, and removing it had taken everything. How she was building something new now, slowly, from actual foundation instead of appearance. I thought about Reed, too, who'd gotten his second chance with Kelsey and Maya, who'd faced consequences but found redemption through taking responsibility for his daughter. The world had been gentler with him than with Vivian, despite his betrayal being more active, his deception more deliberate. But that was how it worked sometimes. Patriarchy wrote different rules for men's mistakes than women's calculations. I thought about Kelsey, who'd been brave enough to blow up her own life and Reed's and Vivian's for the sake of her daughter, who'd risked everything on New Year's Eve to make sure Maya would be acknowledged, supported, given what she deserved. She'd been the catalyst for all of it, the match that lit the fire that burned through so much careful construction of lies. And I thought about myself, about the designer who'd been called a failure now leading creative direction at a growing company, about the woman who'd been called a disgrace now in a healthy relationship with someone who valued her, about the daughter who'd been the disappointment now having regular dinners with parents who'd finally learned to see past achievement to character. The rain soaked through my jacket as I walked, but I didn't mind. There was something cleansing about it, something that felt like washing away old narratives and old pain. I'd survived Vivian's criticism and emerged stronger. She'd hidden behind her mask and emerged broken. Both of us were rebuilding now, but from very different foundations. My phone buzzed. Cameron asking if I wanted him to pick me up, save me from the rain. I texted back that I was walking, that I'd see him soon, that I loved him. Simple messages that represented something Vivian had never had with Reed. Actual care, actual partnership, actual truth. I thought about the girl in the garden 6 months ago, about Kelsey's phone call, about the choice I'd made to open that gate, about how one decision to let truth in had changed everything. Not just for Vivian and Reed, but for me too. Their fall had created space for my rise. Their exposure had shifted family dynamics. Their consequences had somehow freed me. That New Year's Eve felt both forever ago and just yesterday. The countdown, the fireworks, the photographs scattered on the coffee table. The moment everything crystallized into before and after. I'd walked into that party as the family disappointment and walked out as something else entirely. The one brave enough to be real, to let truth destroy what needed destroying. Vivian had called me a disgrace. She'd been right, in a way. I was a disgrace to the values she'd lived by. Performance over substance, appearance over authenticity, status over integrity. I'd refused to play by those rules, and that refusal had made me dangerous to her carefully constructed world. But those rules had been destroying both of us. They'd made her hollow and made me feel inadequate, and neither of those things had been true. We'd both been trapped in a story about worth that was fundamentally flawed. The difference was, I'd escaped it earlier, before I'd sacrificed too much to maintain the illusion. I reached my apartment building, water dripping from my hair, phone full of messages from people who actually cared about me, Cameron asking when I'd be home, my mother inviting me to dinner, a client praising my latest design work, a friend suggesting drinks this weekend, a life full of genuine connection and real achievement, built slowly and honestly over years of staying true to myself. Inside, warm and dry, I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, saw the woman Vivian had criticized for so long, the woman who'd apparently been a disgrace to the family. She looked happy. She looked free. She looked like someone who knew exactly who she was and didn't need anyone's approval to validate it. And that was the victory I hadn't expected. Not Vivian's fall, or Reed's consequences, or the family's shifted perspective. The victory was standing here, comfortable in my own skin, proud of my choices, surrounded by real love instead of conditional acceptance. The victory was knowing that even when everyone told me I wasn't enough, I'd believed differently. And I'd been right. Vivian was learning that lesson now, the hard way, learning to build identity on something other than external validation. Learning to value substance over surface. Learning, maybe, that grace isn't about looking perfect. It's about being real. I hoped she'd find her way to that truth. I hoped she'd discover who she actually was underneath all those years of performance. I hoped she'd build something genuine and be happy with it, even if it looked nothing like the life she'd lost. But her journey wasn't mine anymore. I'd spent too many years carrying the weight of her judgment. I'd freed myself from that burden on New Year's Eve when I opened the gate and let truth in. Now she had to do her own work, fight her own battles, find her own foundation. I had Cameron coming home soon. I had design work I was excited about. I had parents who finally saw me. I had a life built on honest choices and authentic values. I had exactly what Vivian had said I'd never have, achieved through exactly the path she'd called inadequate. And maybe that was the final lesson. That disgrace and grace, failure and success, inadequacy and achievement, they're all just stories we tell about worth. And the people who know their own worth don't need the story to be impressive. They just need it to be true. It's almost New Year's Eve again, a full year since everything changed. I'm sitting in my apartment, though I'll be moving soon, upgrading to a place with actual space now that the salary supports it. Watching snow fall outside my window and thinking about how different this December feels from the last. Cameron's in the kitchen making dinner. We're having people over later, a small gathering of actual friends rather than obligatory family. The smell of something Italian is filling the apartment, and I can hear him humming while he cooks. This is what happiness sounds like, I think. Not impressive or dramatic, just genuine and steady and warm. My phone rings. It's my mother, calling to confirm we'll be at their house for New Year's Day brunch. They're having a smaller celebration this year, just immediate family. Vivian will be there, she mentions carefully, asking if that's okay with me. I tell her it's fine. Vivian and I aren't close, probably never will be, but we've achieved something more important than closeness. We've found honesty. I saw her last week, actually. She'd texted asking if we could meet, and we'd gone to the same cafe where we'd talked in October. She looked different again. Not performing put together anymore, but not broken either. Just normal. Real. She was wearing jeans and a sweater, minimal makeup, hair in a simple ponytail. The kind of outfit she never would have worn a year ago because it wasn't impressive enough. She told me she'd been promoted at work. Not back to her old level, but to a position with more responsibility than she'd had since the scandal. Her firm had decided she'd done enough work rebuilding trust, proved herself committed to genuine growth rather than just image management. She seemed quietly proud of it, not the performative pride I remembered, but something deeper. Like this achievement mattered because it was earned through character, rather than just competence. She asked about my work, and I told her about the new campaign I designed that had won an industry award. She congratulated me without any edge in her voice, without any comparison to her own career, just genuine happiness for my success. It was such a small thing, but it represented enormous change. The old Vivian couldn't have celebrated anyone else's achievement without measuring it against her own. She mentioned that Reed and Kelsey had gotten married in November. A small ceremony. Just family and close friends, with Maya as the flower girl. She'd seen photos through mutual acquaintances and admitted it had stung, seeing him get his happy ending. But she'd also realized she didn't actually want him back. Didn't want that marriage or that life or that version of herself. She said the hardest part of the divorce hadn't been losing Reed. It had been losing the identity she'd built around being Mrs. Hayes. I understood that better than I'd expected to. We'd both been trapped by identities we thought we needed. Hers had been impressive, and mine had been inadequate. But both had been prisons. The difference was I'd escaped earlier, with less spectacular destruction. She asked if I was happy now. Not a challenge or comparison, just genuine curiosity about my life. I told her I was. That I'd found work I was proud of, a partner I loved, relationships with our parents that felt authentic. That I didn't have everything figured out, but I knew who I was, and that was enough. She nodded slowly and said she was working on that, on figuring out who she actually was instead of who she thought she should be. That therapy was helping. That being alone for the first time in her adult life, no performance to maintain, no image to protect, was terrifying, but also clarifying. That she was learning to value things that didn't impress other people. She told me something I'd never expected to hear. She said she'd started painting again. Something she'd loved in college but had abandoned because it wasn't practical, didn't contribute to the perfect resume she was building. Now she was taking classes on weekends, working in watercolor, creating things that had no professional value whatsoever. Just making art because it made her feel like herself. I almost cried hearing that, because it was such a pure example of growth, doing something just for the joy of it, without strategic value or external validation. The Vivian who'd mocked my design work would have never painted for fun. But this new version, the one being built from actual foundation instead of facade, was finding space for creativity again. We hugged when we left, and it felt less awkward than before. Still not sisterly in the way I imagine healthy siblings feel, but real. Two women who'd hurt each other, who were learning to coexist with honesty, who were finding separate paths that occasionally intersected with genuine goodwill. Walking back through the snow to my apartment, I thought about foundations and castles, and the difference between building on sand versus stone. Vivian had spent years constructing something impressive on unstable ground, and when the storm came, everything had collapsed. She was building again now, slower and smaller and sturdier. Whether it would last remained to be seen, but at least she was using better materials this time. I thought about Kelsey too, wondered how she was doing as Reed's wife instead of his secret. Wondered if Maya would grow up knowing the full story of how her parents got together, how her existence had been hidden, how midnight on New Year's Eve had changed everything. Whether she'd understand the courage it took for her mother to demand her father acknowledge her publicly, whether she'd grow up grateful for that choice or confused by the mess that preceded it. And I thought about all of us, really. All the women caught in that web of lies and appearances. Kelsey demanding recognition for her daughter. Vivian choosing status over dignity. Then losing both. Me, enduring years of criticism for refusing to perform. 3 women in one family's orbit, all dealing with the consequences of Reed's deception, but also with bigger questions about worth and identity and what it means to be successful. The patriarchy had written the rules we were all playing by, rules that said men's mistakes could be forgiven through redemption arcs, but women's calculations were unforgivable, rules that praised Vivian's professional achievements while ignoring her character failures. Rules that had made me feel inadequate for choosing authenticity over ambition. Rules that had let Reed maintain 2 families until someone was brave enough to expose him. But we were all finding ways to write new rules now. Kelsey had written herself into Reed's story instead of staying in the margins. I'd stopped letting other people's rules define my worth. And Vivian was learning that rules built on appearance rather than substance always eventually fail. Cameron had dinner ready when I got home. We ate at my small table, soon to be replaced with a bigger one in a bigger apartment, and talked about plans for the new year. He wanted to propose expanding my role at work, giving me a larger team. I wanted to take on more ambitious creative projects. Simple professional growth, the kind that happens when you're building something sustainable rather than spectacular. Later, lying in bed with snow falling outside and Cameron asleep beside me, I thought about this time last year. The garden and the tears and the phone call that changed everything. The decision to open that gate. To let Kelsey in. To allow truth to destroy what needed destroying. I'd made that choice not knowing where it would lead. Knowing only that I was tired of being humiliated. Tired of being the family disappointment. Tired of watching Vivian's cruelty go unchallenged. I'd opened that gate wanting justice, or maybe just wanting Vivian to hurt the way she'd hurt me. But what had followed wasn't really about revenge. It was about revelation. About masks coming off, and foundations cracking, and everyone having to look at truth we'd all been avoiding. The truth that Vivian wasn't perfect. That Reed was a liar. That our family's dynamics were toxic. That appearance and substance weren't the same thing. That I'd been right to choose authenticity even when it looked like failure. Tomorrow night we'd be celebrating New Year's Eve with friends who actually cared about us. People who knew our real selves and liked us anyway. No performances or pretense or pressure to impress. Just genuine connection and honest conversation, and probably too much wine, and counting down to midnight with people who mattered. And the day after, I'd go to my parents' house for brunch, sit across from Vivian, and make small talk and maintain the careful distance we'd achieved. Watch my parents try to balance love for both daughters with awareness of the damage done. Navigate family dynamics that were healthier than before but still complicated, still carrying weight from years of dysfunction. But I'd do it knowing who I was, knowing my worth wasn't defined by Vivian's opinion or my parents' approval or anyone's measure of success except my own. Knowing I'd built something real and lasting, something that could weather storms because it was founded on truth rather than image. That's what I'd learned in the year since Kelsey called me in that garden. That you can't build lasting happiness on lies. That performing perfection is exhausting and ultimately futile. That the people who call you a disgrace often see in you the mirror of their own inadequacy. That courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being yourself even when everyone tells you that self isn't good enough. Vivian had called me a disgrace because I'd refused to play by rules that required sacrificing authenticity for approval. And she'd been right that I was a disgrace to those rules. But those rules had been destroying us both. Breaking them had freed me. Following them had broken her. Now we were both rebuilding. Me from a place of strength, her from rubble. Both trying to create lives that felt genuine instead of impressive. Both learning that grace isn't about looking perfect. It's about being real, even when real is messy and imperfect and small. The snow kept falling outside my window. Tomorrow would bring new year, new beginnings, new chances to choose authenticity over appearance. For me, that choice had already been made. I'd made it years ago when I'd chosen freelance design over corporate jobs, chosen living honestly over performing success, chosen being myself over being impressive. For Vivian, the choice was newer and harder. She was still learning that rebuilding from honesty was possible, that life without the mask could be meaningful, that worth didn't require external validation. Whether she'd fully embrace that truth or eventually drift back toward old patterns remained uncertain. People don't change completely, don't transform overnight. Real growth is slow and imperfect, and often frustrating. But at least she was trying. At least she'd stopped attacking me for living the truth she'd been afraid to embrace. At least we'd found honest distance instead of hostile proximity. That was something. Maybe not sisterhood, maybe not reconciliation, but something real instead of performed. And real was enough. Real was more than enough. Real was everything that mattered. So when midnight comes tomorrow and everyone's counting down and making toasts and setting intentions for the new year, I'll be grateful. Grateful for Cameron and my career and my parents' changed perspective. Grateful for friends who know me and like me anyway. Grateful for the hard lessons learned and the strength found and the freedom earned. But mostly, I'll be grateful for that moment in the garden when I chose truth over comfort. When I opened the gate and let consequences in. When I decided that watching Vivian's cruelty finally face accountability mattered more than keeping family peace. That choice changed everything. Not just for her, but for me. It freed me from years of feeling inadequate. It showed my parents who they'd been enabling and who they'd been ignoring. It gave me permission to stop performing the role of disappointed daughter and start embracing the reality of authentic woman. If you're watching this and hearing this story, I hope you'll take something from it. That appearances lie. That performing perfection destroys you slowly. That people who attack your authenticity are often terrified of their own. That choosing truth over comfort is painful, but necessary. That foundations built on lies always eventually crumble. But foundations built on honesty can weather anything. I hope you'll choose authenticity even when it looks like failure. Even when people call you inadequate, or disappointing, or a disgrace. Because those judgments say more about their fears than your worth. And real worth comes from knowing yourself, living honestly, building genuine connections rather than impressive images. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching this from? What city? What country? What corner of the world are you rebuilding your own life in? Leave a comment and let me know. Let's build community around honesty instead of performance, around substance instead of surface. And if you want to follow these stories, if you want to hear more about real people choosing truth over comfort, hit that subscribe button. Because there are more stories to tell, more masks to remove, more foundations to expose as sand instead of stone. New Year's Eve is coming. Fireworks will explode, champagne will flow, people will make promises about who they'll become. But real change doesn't happen at midnight. It happens in gardens and phone calls and difficult choices and slow rebuilding. It happens when you decide that being real matters more than looking impressive. Vivian made her choice on that New Year's Eve a year ago, to protect appearances at any cost. I made mine too, to let truth destroy what needed destroying. We're both living with those choices now. Her in her modest condo learning to paint again. Me and my growing life built on honest foundation. Different choices, different consequences, different futures. But both of us finally, living something real instead of performing something fake. And that makes all the difference. That makes everything worth it. That's how you survive being called a disgrace. By building a life so authentic, so genuine, so honestly yours, that disgrace becomes the highest compliment anyone could give. Because if living truthfully makes me a disgrace to a system built on lies, I'll wear that label with pride, every single day, for the rest of my life. Happy New Year. May yours be built on foundations that last.